Hi folks, this is Mr. Vanderpool. I wanted to talk to you guys really quickly about the 2023 AP Macroeconomics Update in Monetary Policy. This was implemented a few years ago, and this looks at monetary policy in an economy with ample reserves. This is as opposed to what we've already learned, which is monetary policy in an economy with limited reserves, in which the Federal Reserve has to change the amount of reserves by using its tools such as the discount rate, the reserve requirement ratio, and open market operations. So let's move on looking at ample reserves. So today and in the foreseeable future, there are ample reserves in the U.S. banking system. The Federal Reserve doesn't have to create more reserves. There are ample reserves in the U.S. banking system. So in 2006, the Federal Reserve was authorized by Congress to pay interest on reserves, IOR, that is the abbreviation that you will see. Another name for this is the policy rate, or PR. So the interest on reserves and policy rate, we're going to pretty much use simultaneously. They mean the same thing, at least in this context. Basically, banks will get paid this interest rate to hold excess and required reserves. So this allows the Federal Reserve to set a nominal interest rate floor. Okay, so you can't go below the floor. For example, if the Fed pays 5% on reserves, banks will not lend to other banks at any cheaper than 5%. Effectively, this allows the Fed to directly set nominal interest rates. So in an ample reserve environment, the Federal Reserve, all it has to do is, it doesn't have to go through the tools of open market operations and all that to set interest rates. All it has to do is directly set nominal interest rates by changing interest on reserves, which, of course, in this context, is the policy rate. It can directly do it. It's actually a little bit more simple than in a limited reserves environment. It is also important to note that the nominal interest rate ceiling is set by the discount rate. Banks will not borrow at a rate higher than this because they would rather just borrow from the Federal Reserve's discount window. Why borrow for more money when you can borrow from the Federal Reserve at a lower rate? All right. So I want to look at the graphs regarding monetary policy in ample reserves here. All right. So here we're looking at the market for reserves. You can see on our y-axis, we have the policy rate. On the x-axis, we have quantity of reserves. We have the floor, which is the policy rate. In this case, it's PR1, and you have a horizontal line there. And then you have the ceiling, which is the discount rate. You can see there's a horizontal line there. Now it's dotted because it's kind of more theoretical at this point. And then you have the supply of reserves, which would be set by the Federal Reserve, and that's a vertical line. So in this case, it's to the right. This vertical line is to the right of point B. And if the supply of reserves is to the right of point B, that means that you are in an ample, abundant is just kind of a more extreme example of ample, an ample reserve environment. Because when you change the supply of reserves, you're not changing the policy rate, as you can see. So the supply of reserves is going to be set by the Fed, and it's going to be that vertical line right there. The trickiest part is the demand for reserves, or in this case, DR. So we're going to start at the upper left-hand corner of demand for reserves, where we've hit the ceiling. All right. And when we're going to the right on demand for reserves, we hit point A. At point A, you're starting to, and then at this point, you're in a limited reserve environment. Anything to the left of B is going to be a limited reserve environment. So at this point, the Federal Reserve is using its traditional tools to go ahead and set interest rates. So open market operations, discount rate, etc. And then we're going to keep going. It's going to be a downward sloping curve to B. At point B and to the right, you see that we hit the floor. In this case, it's the policy rate. And you can see to the right of point B, we are in a ample reserve environment. Okay, the policy rate is just that the demand for reserves is along that policy rate, and if you shift the supply of reserves, you're not going to actually be changing the policy rate. So, in order to emphasize that, let's look at the next graph there. So, changes in the supply of reserves in an economy with ample resources. You can see in this particular graph, supply of reserves 1 is a vertical line. And then if it shifts to the left, you have supply of reserves 3. There would be a decrease in the supply of reserves. An increase in the supply of reserves would be supply of reserves 2. And as you can see with all of that, the policy rate is not changing in that case. And that is because you are beyond point B and you are in an ample reserve environment. So let's take a look at what happens if the Federal Reserve actually wants to implement monetary policy in this type of ample reserves environment, and they would thus just shift the policy rate or interest on reserves. So let's go, we're looking at figure 4.66, and we're going to go to the left, all the way to the left side where it says increase in demand. And we're going to, in this case, increase the policy rate. Why would the Fed increase the policy rate? Because they want to fight inflation. They want to slow down the economy, so they're going to increase the policy rate. Now that's going to cause the demand for reserves to shift up. All right, and so that raises the floor to policy rate 2. It would raise the ceiling to discount rate 2. But overall, what's happening there is that you're going to see a higher policy rate and higher interest on reserves, and that is going to cause it to be more expensive to borrow and invest, and thus firms will borrow and invest less, and you'll have a slowdown of the economy, which is useful in fighting inflation. Now, let's go to the right side where it says decrease in demand. So let's say you wanted to lower the policy rate. As you can see, the floor went down to PR2. The ceiling went down to DR2. You're basically lowering the policy rate there. And by lowering the policy rate, and remember the Federal Reserve can directly lower the policy rate, you are basically going to encourage more consumption, more investment, because it's cheaper to borrow and invest and consume. You're going to increase aggregate demand, and ultimately that would be useful in fighting a recession or an unemployment type scenario, where unemployment is a problem. All right. So I believe that is it, and it is. So we're going to talk more about this over the next couple days, but I hope you guys have a great evening. Bye-bye.